Today we're going to talk about flowering and reproduction of crop plants, or any plants for that matter. You recall that back when we were talking about growth and metabolism, I said there were three things that we have to consider when it comes to light and its effects on plants. One of them was, of course, the light intensity, how intense the light was. The other one was the frequency of the light, what color it was basically, and the other one that I mentioned was duration. Now, I didn't really deal with duration in the previous lecture because it has much more importance and much more impact here when we're talking about flowering and reproduction. So we'll get to that here in just a minute. But we want to talk first about flower structure. Flower structures, the way they look, most flowers are going to have essentially the same parts. They do vary widely in their appearance, however. The way those parts are arranged, the various colors, there's a wide variation in that, and usually, it used to be at least, that the elements of flower structure were one of the chief ways that taxonomists classified plants. They looked for similarities in flower structure to determine which plants were related, because within a particular family, for example, flower structures were highly conserved, and that is to say that they would be very similar among members of the same family. Nowadays they rely more on molecular tools, DNA fingerprints, to determine relatedness of plants. But flower structures can be very similar among related plants. You recall that the Malvaceae family, for example, flowers of cotton, okra, and hibiscus, all are very similar, even though the plants themselves are quite dissimilar and have completely different uses. So all flowers, well, not all flowers, but there are some what we call essential flower parts that make it a flower. These are going to be your pistil and your stamens. The pistil, of course, is the female flower part. The stamens is the male flower part. The pistil will contain the egg and the ovule that will eventually become a seed or an embryo. And the stamens, of course, will be the site of pollen production. This particular diagram of a flower here is a very typical flower. It has a pistil here. This is where pollen is collected. This is the stamen. This is where pollen is produced. There are other parts of flowers, though. The essential ones are the ones that are involved in reproduction. These have other roles in plants. They have the role of protection of essential flower parts. They have the role of attraction to pollinators or for other reasons, and show. And of course, many of our domesticated ornamental plants are selected based on the appearance of the flower. Grasses, by the way, usually lack accessory flower parts. We don't associate grasses with having very showy flowers, although there are many monocots that do have very showy flowers, most notably the lily, the orchid, and the wide variety of plants associated with those two groups of plants. One of the ways you can remember if you have trouble keeping track of whether this is which one of these is male and which one is female, as this accountant is apparently having a problem with here because of the way these two restroom doors are labeled. If you notice that the stamen has the word men in it, and that this, of course, the stamen, remember, is the male flower part, and pistil doesn't have anything to do with females in its name, of course, but you might remember, maybe you don't, probably don't, I don't, I'm not even that old, remember an old song called Pistol Packin' Mama. It was an old song back in the 30s or 40s, I don't remember. It was a big popular song back at that time, but it was Pistol Packin' Mama, and if you remember that, then you can remember the mama part relating to the female aspects of it. But the stamen is the male, the pistil is the female. A more detailed diagram of a typical dicot flower, and this comes from figure 10-1 of your textbook. Here are your essential flower parts here. Your pistil consisting of your stigma. The stigma is the surface up here at the top that collects. It's an area that receives the pollen. The style is a slender tube that connects the stigma to the ovary. The ovary itself holds the ovules. The ovules are inside the ovary, and when fertilization occurs, when pollen lands here and the pollen tube grows down and fertilizes this ovule, it will become the seed. The ovary itself, as it matures, will become a mature fruit. So we'll look at some examples of those in laboratory to let you know a little bit more about that kind of detail. Again, here's the other essential flower part, the stamen, composed of the anthers. This is where pollen is actually produced, and the filament, again, a long, slender structure here that holds the anthers up high and keeps them in close proximity with the stigma. Now, one of the things about this particular arrangement here, this arrangement of close proximity of stamen and stigma, is that in a lot of species, particularly domesticated species, the pollen will actually come from the anther within the same flower. So the actual union of gametes that will occur here is going to be a union of gametes from the same plant. This is what we refer to as self-pollination, and most of our crop plants are self-pollinated. Many of them are not, and there are notable exceptions to this, and we will talk about those a little bit later on. But bear in mind that domestication, for whatever reason, generally tended to favor self-pollinated plants, and there are genetic reasons for this. And if you really want to know about that, you'll need to take my class, CSES 5103/6103, Plant Genetics and Crop Improvement, also offered as a distance course. But down here we see our accessory flower parts, the petal, the sepal. The petal is generally going to be colored in some way. The sepal will generally be the same color as the rest of the plant, generally green. And the pedicel here is the connecting structure that connects the flower to the rest of the plant. Typical grass flower looks quite a bit different. And what we see here, we have two different diagrams. On the left we have a floret, and on the right we have a spikelet. A floret is actually a subunit of the spikelet. As you see here, here is basically this structure. This part of the structure here is basically this structure. This structure is the floret here. The floret is shown in more detail here. And you can see that we have here, while we have some different names, those names are not important. You don't need to memorize those, with the exception again of the stamen. You have the anther here. You have the filament, just like you did in the dicot flower, and you have the stigma. The stigma does have a little bit of a different appearance. It's kind of a feathery looking structure with a lot of protruding hairs. These allow and facilitate the capture of pollen again from the anther. And again, for many of our grass plants, we have self-pollination occurring. For many of them, we do not. And of course, these structures, again, can vary. These diagrams that I show here are sort of representative, but these structures can vary quite a bit. And we'll show you some, at some points during the semester, we'll show you some very, very different looking flowers, but basically they're all composed in different places maybe of these same parts. And so what you have over here in the right is spikelet, is actually sort of a type of inflorescence, and we'll learn about that in the laboratory, which is an arrangement of flowers on the stem. And to look at a wheat flower as a, not a diagram but a real flower, we see over here we see on the left hand side the anthers, the anther structure. And as we take this apart, here's a glume, these surrounding protective parts. If we take these apart and look in detail at what we're looking at here, here again is the anther. Here's this very feathery, hairy looking stigma. The filament, of course, connecting the anther with the rest of the flower. The style here at the base of the stigma, and the ovary here. The ovary in this case, in the case of a wheat flower, contains one ovule and will become that mature fruit. The kernel, the mature ovary, will contain within it the true seed, which is the embryo of the wheat plant. Cotton flower is a typical dicot flower. Here's a photograph of a cotton flower in the field. Here are the anther structures here. This is the stigma. This part here is the stigma. Again, you see the close proximity of the anthers to the stigma. In the case of cotton, you can have insects that actually move pollen from flower to flower, but a lot of this pollen is pollinating this stigma here is going to come from the anthers within that flower. As soon as this structure, this flower, this fruit, if you will, or this flower at this point is pollinated, the fruit will begin to develop down here. The ovary will begin to develop. This will develop into the bowl, which is the fruit of the cotton plant. And again, here's a cutaway version with your stigma, your anthers here, your style, your filament for the anthers, and again the ovary containing the very small ovules, which you can't really see. These outer structures here labeled as bracts are the same thing as sepals were in a previous diagram that we looked at. In cotton, and some other plants, they're referred to as bracts. But again, they serve more of a protective role than anything else. So let's look at some of the categorization of flowers and inflorescences. Now let's distinguish between these two. First of all, flowers are what we've been looking at. Flowers are the places that have the sexual organs, the male and female organs. Inflorescence is an arrangement of flowers on the plant. Some plants arrange their flowers in some ways, and some of them arrange them in others, and these are categorized as differences in inflorescence. We'll look at those again more in detail in laboratory. Flowers can be described as complete, and these are flowers that contain all parts. They have sepals, they have petals, they have the pistil, and they have the stamens. And not all flowers, of course, have all these parts. Flowers that are incomplete lack one or more of the above parts. And in fact, most grasses do not have, for example, sepals and petals, so they're mostly incomplete. Some of them may even lack a pistil. Some of them may lack a stamen. They rarely lack both. They wouldn't be a flower, but it is possible to have male flowers and female flowers. Perfect flowers are described as those that have both male and female parts, regardless of whether they are complete or incomplete. It doesn't matter. As long as they have a pistil and a stamen within the same flower, they are regarded as a perfect flower. Imperfect flowers will have either male or female parts, but not both. There are not a lot of species that we have domesticated, at least, that have this particular characteristic. Some notable examples would be corn. Corn is a plant that has flowers at the top, the tassel, and a flower at the bottom, or along the side of the plant. Well, it's called the ear, or and again, an ear is an inflorescence, really, but not a flower. But you have the tassel at the top in corn. This is the male, where the pollen is produced, and then you have the silk at the bottom, or ear, and this is the female. Of course, in the case of corn, you don't have the close proximity of the tassel to the silk, so you have a lot of cross-pollination going on as a result of that. Female flowers are referred to as pistillate flowers. Male flowers are referred to as staminate flowers. There are other examples of plants that have that. Hemp is a good example. Hops, hemp and hops both. Hemp being a fiber crop, hops being a crop that's used to flavor malt beverages. Both of these plants have these pistillate or staminate flowers. They are either pistillate plants or staminate plants, and normally, depending on which purpose of the plant is whether you prefer one or the other. And again, that leads us to the next one here, are the dioecious plants, and this is really not referring to a flower, but a species, or a plant itself. These are plant species that have male and female flowers borne on different plants. So you have male plants, pistillate plants, male plants, staminate plants, female plants, pistillate plants. Again, some of the examples here are hemp, ginkgo, some fruits, and as I said, the other example that I gave was hops. And hops is something that we don't see growing much around here. It grows up in the Pacific Northwest, cultured quite extensively up there, but I read an article in the paper today, there are people in the Southeast attempting now to grow hops here in the Southeast in a very hop inhospitable climate, simply because of the demand by the local breweries that need local sourced materials. So there may be some hop culture be going on here very soon in the Southeast. The This is a photograph here of a ginkgo tree, and you may not be familiar with this species. We have them growing on campus. They grow in various places. People have them. Normally, with the ginkgo tree, though, all you will ever see are the males, the male plants. It's used as an ornamental, the male plants, because the females, if they're there, they produce a fruit as a female that is very odoriferous, very stinky, and not a desirable plant to have in your landscape. So people don't plant female ginkgo trees, they plant male ginkgo trees. They have a very nice color in the fall. They're very beautiful. If you've ever been to the campus of Clemson University during October, you would see brilliant colors, and most of those are ginkgo trees that are on campus there. The ginkgo tree is also a fascinating plant in that it is a very, very old, evolutionarily speaking, species, over some 300 million years old, I believe. I'd have to check that to make sure, but it's preserved remarkably well. It exists in it's sort of like a shark. It's the shark of the plant world. It exists in pretty much the same form. They found ginkgo fossils that are hundreds of millions of years old, and the leaf shape is the same, and the plant looks essentially the same as it did then. So it hasn't changed very much. Those plants that have other terms that you might come across are the terms monoecious. Well, we talked about dioecious. These are species that have male and female flowers borne on different plants, but monoecious, and most crop plants are monoecious, have the male and female flowers borne on the same plant. Even corn, for example, is a monoecious plant. Even though it has separate male and female flowers, they are still borne on the same plant, which makes it a monoecious plant. Synoecious are plants that have perfect flowers. Now, what are the factors that affect flowers and flowering in plants? This is of interest to us because for most of the crops that we grow, the flower is ultimately the most important part. I mean, if you take a cotton plant, for example, the flower is in the bowl. If you take a wheat plant, the wheat kernel is actually the fruit results from flowering. And if you take any other thing that we're almost always, for purposes of eating, we're almost always harvesting a fruit. Some exceptions, of course. Sugarcane doesn't work that way. Sugar beets don't work that way. Potatoes don't work that way. But most of the time, we're actually interested in harvesting the fruits or the grains or the seeds or something that's a result of flowering. So what causes plants to flower? What stimulates them to flower? One of them are nutritional factors. Some plants do flower in response to fertility, but this is relatively unimportant in crops, and we're not going to worry about it too much here. Of much more important is the light, and here's where the light comes in: light and the photoperiod. Remember, we talked about earlier that how the duration of light is important, and when we mention the term photoperiod, we are talking about the period, the length of light in a day. And we know that this varies depending on the time of the year it is. Of course, in winter time we have short days here at this latitude, and as you go farther north they get shorter. In the summertime here we have much longer days. So throughout the year the day length will fluctuate, and it is this fluctuation in day length that allows plants to sense the change in the season. They know when wintertime is coming because the day lengths start to get shorter, and when they sense that, then they might begin the reproductive process. And by the same term, they might also be sensing when the days are becoming longer and initiate flowering in response to that stimulus as well, depending upon whether they are a cool season or a warm season plant. So we can divide plants up into three basic types: those that flower in response to shortening days, the short day plants; those that flower in response to lengthening days, the long day plants; and those that flower in response to not the day length. They don't have a day length response. It doesn't matter to them what the day length is as long as they're getting some light. These are day neutral plants. Some examples of short day plants would include soybean, tobacco, sorghum, corn. Some examples of long day plants are mostly the small grains: wheat, oat, barley, and we can see that all these up here are warm season, plants, and these down here are cool season. Because again, when you have a cool season plant and you want it to flower in the spring is when days are getting longer. It's going to flower in the spring to be ready to harvest in the very early summer. Some of these day neutral plants, alfalfa, cotton, field beans, it turns out that most plants do show some day length response. During the domestication, though, we have tended to select out that trait because it's kind of annoying to work with from a production standpoint. It doesn't allow you much flexibility in planting dates, and it doesn't allow you to move a species north and south very much because day lengths differ. The day length in Minnesota this time of the year is very different from what it is here. If you go to England, for example, in the summertime, the sun doesn't go down there until around 11 o'clock at night, and they're so far north, and the sun comes up the next day around 3 o'clock in the morning. So they don't have a very long night. They have a very long day. By the opposite means, in the wintertime up there, the days are very short and the nights are very, very long. But a lot of these plants, these in particular, alfalfa, cotton, and field beans, these tend to have day neutrality, but a lot of their wild relatives, the ones that we use as a genetic resource, would tend to still be photoperiodic, and this can cause problems at times also. So let's look at what happens here with these flowers. If we take a short day plant, for example, and we have a 24-hour period here, of which we have 12 hours of light. This would be really probably more like 14 hours. Let's say we have 14 and 14 hours of light and 10 hours of darkness here, and over here we have let's say 10 hours of light and 14 hours of darkness. A short day plant, if exposed to this long day here, would tend to, remember it's looking for shorter days, would tend to remain vegetative. Under a long day, a long day plant, on the other hand, is looking for long days. It would tend to flower because it's getting this longer day length here. By the same token, short day plant under a short day, 10-hour day and a 14-hour night would tend to flower. A long day plant would tend to remain vegetative because it's seeing a very short day, not a long day. Now, at the same time, if we take a short day plant and just expose it to this same light regime, it's getting a short day here. Now it's getting a brief, let's say 5 minutes, very brief. 5 minutes of daylight here. We've got 2 short days, and really you would expect that plant to remain to flower, but in practice it remains vegetative. And likewise, you would expect this long day plant, it's getting this very long, it's not getting a long day, it's getting 2 very short days. You would expect it to remain vegetative, but in fact it flowers. And it bothered people for a long time. They couldn't figure out why they observed this type of response in these plants. It's right the opposite of what you would expect. And as it turns out, it's not the length of the day or the light period at all that's causing this response. It is the length of the dark period. And we should really be calling these short day instead of a short day plant. We should call it a long night, because that's really what's going on. It's looking for long nights. Long day plants are looking for short nights. And if you now evaluate these responses in this regard, then it all makes sense. Because here's a short day plant. It's looking for a long night to make it flower, but it's not going to get one. It's got a short night, so it stays vegetative. The long day plant's looking for a short night. It has a short night, 10 hours, so it's going to flower. If you reverse the length of the dark and the light, your short day plant here is looking for, again, a long night. It's getting a long night. It's going to flower. Your long day plant's looking for a short night. It's not getting a short night. It's going to stay vegetative. And remember that, if I'm not clear about this, vegetative always precedes flowering. Plant has to be in a vegetative stage and then get triggered into flowering by the day length response. So when I say it stays vegetative, it means it doesn't flower. It's always going to be vegetated until it's stimulated to flower by the light period. And so if you take this short day, long night plant, it's looking for a long night. You can see it's not getting one. This long night that it had has now been interrupted and broken up by this light period, so it's going to stay vegetative. Your short night plant is looking for short nights, and it sees two of them, and so it's going to go ahead and flower. So now all of this response makes sense when you look at it as the dark period that is actually influencing these plants as opposed to the period of light. Now, what we have shown here, the times involved here, it's really not, there's really no hard and fast rule with regard to 1410. Those are numbers I just pulled out of the hat because it all makes sense if we do it that way. Really what you have here with these photoperiodic plants is a critical period. Every different species, every genotype, every cultivar has if it's a photoperiodic plant, has a critical photoperiod that causes this particular response. That critical, let me give you an example. Let's say you have a short day plant like the soybean. It may have a critical photoperiod of, let's say, 14.5 hours. And what that means is that at that critical photoperiod, if it sees a day that is 14.5 hours or shorter, let's say it's seeing 15-hour days, and you switch it to 14-hour days, that's going to trigger the flowering response. Even though the days, it says it's a short day, you've still got a 14-hour day. It's a longer day period than it is dark period. But because 14.5 hours is the critical photo period, then a 14-hour day is going to make it flower. 14.5, anything shorter than 14.5 hours day length is going to make it flower. Now it takes a couple of days. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes a couple of days. If you do it for a week, you'll start to see flower tissue begin to develop. But as you can see, it is this critical photo period that is important. Now if you have a long day plant with a critical photo period of 14.5 hours, it will flower with day lengths of 14.5 hours or longer. Or if it has a critical photo period of 8.5 hours, it will flower with a critical photo period of 8.5 hours or longer. So it is the critical photo period or longer in long day plants that stimulates flowering, or the critical photo period or shorter in short day plants that stimulates flowering. Now, a little later on in the semester, we're going to talk about soybean. Soybean is the most photoperiodic crop that we grow. There are others, but soybean has extreme photoperiod response. And so we'll need to understand what it means in soybean when you have a soybean cultivar adapted to, let's say, Wisconsin or Minnesota, as opposed to a soybean cultivar adapted to Alabama. They have to have completely different photoperiod response. Other things that can affect flowering is the temperature, and this is primarily a factor in small grains. And the reason being is that you've got to have, for these small grains, you've got to have a cold temperature to stimulate flowering. And what happens is these things get planted in the fall. Remember, these small grains, they're cool season crops. They get planted in the fall. It's usually fairly warm at that time. And then wintertime sets in, and they go dormant. They've grown some, they've germinated, they've come up, they've established themselves, they've developed a canopy of sorts. And then they sort of go into dormancy during the winter months. And during this period, you have to have a certain amount of cold temperature, cold requirement, so that when it starts warming up again in the spring, you'll have flowering. It's noted that in Alabama, it's kind of difficult to grow certain small grains along the Gulf Coast, particularly rye, for example, because they don't get the cold requirement that they need to make them flower good, start flowering good in the spring. A lot of our fruit trees need to be vernalized. This is the best example we have is the peach. In Alabama, sometimes we get concerned with our peach crop if we don't have enough cold weather during the winter to vernalize those peaches and cause them to flower in the spring. If you have a warm winter and the plant doesn't get exposure to the cold weather, then they're not going to flower very well in the spring, and it's going to damage the peach crop. But as far as the agronomic crops are concerned, it is the small grains that show the most response to temperature and vernalization. So, in looking at some of the methods of reproduction, one of the methods that plants reproduce by is by sexual means. Sexual reproduction. This involves gametes. The gametes have to come together. The male gamete, the pollen, the female gamete, the egg or the ovule. These gametes are produced in the anthers and in the stigma, or the pistil. And sexual fertilization now, not pollination. Pollination is just the movement of pollen from the anthers to the stigma. Fertilization is the union of male and female gametes, and basically what you have here is here's your pistil or your stigmatic surface here, represented here by this this grayed out area, and you'll have a pollen grain up here that will germinate, sort of like a seed does, but it basically sticks out. It germinates a pollen tube that contains the gametes inside. There are a couple of different gametes here. These gametes will perform double fertilization is what they do. There are two gametes here. The tube nucleus sort of helps guide this tube down into the toward the ovary and toward the ovule, and this is called double fertilization. And it's the union of two male gametes with the egg and the polar nuclei. The egg and the polar nuclei are both within the ovule. The union of the male gamete with the egg will produce the embryo. The union of male gametes with the polar nuclei will produce the endosperm. And this will feed the young embryo and help that seed germinate and feed the young developing embryo and young developing seedling at the same time. Again, pollination is nothing more than the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. It is distinct from fertilization. Just because you get pollination occurring does not mean that you're going to get fertilization occurring. Again, as I pointed out earlier, some crops are primarily cross-pollinated, some are primarily self-pollinated. Most species will fall into one category or the other. Some species, there are a few that sort of can go either way. Cotton is a good example. It can be cross-pollinated or it can be self-pollinated depending upon whether there's insect vectors in the field. Some plants are wind cross-pollinated, like corn, for example. And self-pollination rarely occurs in a cornfield. It can, but it's the exception rather than the rule. And if you want to really know more about this, the impact of these two different modes of pollination on reproduction and other factors, you can take my other class. So we also have asexual methods of reproduction. Generally, we have other terms that we refer to this as either vegetative propagation. Is used to maintain genetic purity, because when you vegetatively propagate something, again using these types of plant parts like rhizomes, tubers, bulbs, corms, cutting, grafting. They do a lot of this in horticultural crops, fruit trees in particular, ornamentals. We don't do a lot of it in agronomic crops. We do have at least one forage, Bermuda grass, hybrid Bermuda grass, and some turf grasses, hybrid turf grasses that reproduce through stolons. The stolons is not listed here, but the stolon is an asexual, is a modified stem, you'll recall, and it has a role in asexual propagation. But what you get when you propagate something asexually is you get an exact copy of the plant itself. There's no meiosis going on, no recombination of genes. No fertilization, no reduction in chromosome number followed by restoration of the chromosome number with fertilization. It's just an exact copy. So, and when we say used to maintain genetic purity, that's what we mean. The advantage of asexual propagation, of course, is that once you find a plant that you like, you can propagate it forever without any change taking place. Another way that this can be done is through the process of apomixis, which is not very common, not common at all in crop plants. It occurs in some grasses. You get a production of seed. You do have actual seed produced, but there's no sexual fertilization. The seed, though, are like little clones, and they represent the exact copy of the mother plant. But we don't see that much in crop plants at all. It does happen in bluegrass, and that's a very important turf species if you go above North Alabama. So that's the end of the lecture of this section today. We'll talk about something else next time.